Is the blacknose or black-striped crappie a different species from the black crappie and white crappie? What about a Magnolia crappie? And should you open a lifeless spot for them? We'll cover these questions and go over why this color morph is fairly unique in the world of fishes. What's up everyone, I am Koa and this is KNFS, where we anglers are always learning and sharing knowledge about fishing and fishes. Out at my university research ponds, we have about 90 ponds and a handful of them haven't been touched in years. I was doing some inventory and found some natural blacknose or black-striped crappie, and I figured I'd share with you a bit on this color morph. The presentation of color on this morph varies, but typically is presented with a black stripe starting on the interior part of the snout and extending to the dorsal fin. In some populations, and like we see here, the black pigmentation will extend more, possibly starting on the chin, extending over the lips, and even reaching the tips of the spines and rays on the dorsal fin. So let's clear up that big question. Is the blacknose crappie a different species than the black crappie and white crappie? The blacknose crappie morph is not a distinct species. The blacknose crappie is most often naturally found as a morph of the black crappie, as in it's just a black crappie that looks different. So you could technically find blacknose crappie in most all populations of naturally occurring black crappie, and we'll get into the genetics on that in a bit. This extra black pigmentation can also be seen on the hybrid cross of a male blacknose crappie. Again, remember that blacknose crappie is just a different color morph of the black crappie with a female white crappie. These black and white crappie hybrids are called Magnolia crappie. And typically in aquaculture, they are making those Magnolia crappie sterile triploids by pressure treating the eggs. In the wild, hybrid crappie are not usually sterile, but definitely not as fecund, or is capable of producing survivable offspring as pure parent species. Unlike some online resources might suggest, the Magnolia crappie is not a distinct species of fish. In biology, we just don't count the vast majority of hybrids as unique species because hybrids just don't have the reproduction capability to set up survivable populations on their own to be considered distinct species. But that doesn't mean you can't create 2 extra slots on your fishing life list for a blacknose crappie and a Magnolia crappie. Although you'd probably need some genetic work and or some background stocking information on the water to know which was which. Because remember, one is just a black crappie that looks different and the other is a hybrid. And really, even with naturally occurring crappie hybrids between white and black, a genetic test is often needed to confirm that ID. It is very difficult at times to tell crappie hybrids from just black crappie is usually what they're confused with. And even Magnolia crappie, the black nose times the white, not all of them are gonna have that black stripe. So it's tricky. So let's get into the genetics a bit. Nothing complicated, nothing you haven't seen in your 7th grade biology course. Here's a bit of familiar terminology for you. We'll consider this black stripe as a trait. And traits are expressed because of genes. Chromosomes contain a hell of a lot of genes, and crappies are naturally diploid like us, so they just get a set of chromosomes from each of the parents, the male and the female. Researchers in the 70s first theorized that this black stripe trait was a recessive trait. An easy example of a recessive trait is blue eyes in humans. Dark eye color, relatively, is considered a dominant trait. Technically, eye color is controlled by a number of genes, but for simplicity, we'll just diagram how recessive and dominant work at a single gene. If a person has 2 copies of the recessive allele at a specific gene, of which we are labeling as EC here, lowercase EC, then they'll have blue eyes. And allele is just a term for a variant form of a gene. So there are 2 alleles in this situation, and both alleles are the same. If a person even has 1 copy of the dominant allele with the capitalized EC, then they'll have dark eyes. So they could have 2 copies of the dominant allele, or just 1 copy of the dominant allele, and the dark eye color still wins out. I'm sure this Mendelian cross table looks familiar to you. Assuming this single gene truly controls eye color at this spot, If a blue-eyed person and a dark-eyed person having both versions of the gene that express the dominant trait ever have a child, then that child will have dark eyes because it will inherit one copy of the recessive allele from the blue-eyed parent and one copy of the dominant allele from the dark-eyed parent. So we say that F1 generation, or first generation, will be 100% dark-eyed. A blue-eyed and dark-eyed person could still have a child with blue eyes if the dark-eyed parent was carrying one copy of the recessive gene. Then there would be a 50% chance of the child having blue eyes. So let's go back to the 70s when these researchers first theorized that this black stripe in Crappie was a recessive trait, like my blue eyes is a recessive trait. Well, it sort of makes sense that they would make this assumption because in most populations where the black stripe appears, there are still more normal-looking black Crappie than Crappie with the color morph. But genetics and evolution are more complicated than that. Just look at blue eyes in Sweden. About 3/4 of the population shows this recessive phenotype, while most of the world expresses the dominant phenotype. In the early 2000s, some researchers actually tested whether this black stripe trait in Crappie was recessive or dominant. And curiously enough, they found that the black stripe is a dominant trait. They determined that a mutation at a specific gene causes the black stripe to appear. They discovered this as they took male black Crappie that had the black stripe that were of known origin, so they had been raised in a hatchery, and they knew that these ones had 2 copies of the dominant gene. And they did the same thing with a female black Crappie of known origin that did not have the black stripe because those females had 2 copies of the recessive gene. When crossed, all of the offspring possessed the black stripe. They did the same cross by switching the male and female, and again, all offspring had the black stripe. The mating of these F1 specimens, each having 1 copy of each the dominant and recessive gene, led to almost a 3-to-1 ratio of the F2 or second generation offspring, of which aligns well with the Mendelian ratio when one gene has significant control of a single trait. So then I'm sure you're asking, like I asked, well, if this trait truly is dominant, then why aren't we seeing more of it? And the bottom line is, well, we just don't know. We haven't done any research to really figure that out. But we can assume that these black-nosed Crappie are still breeding with normal black Crappie, and we'd see that the normal-looking Crappie can still appear when they cross. Even black-nosed times black-nosed Crappie could produce normal black Crappie. We also don't know if the fecundity or success of the reproduction and offspring survival is perhaps lessened for the black-nosed Crappie. It could be something else that mutates genetically in tandem with the gene that controls this black stripe that could then cause them to be less fertile. Or perhaps there's a sexual selection change where just because of their appearance of having extra black, other black Crappie don't want to mate with them. It's all speculation without research, and there probably isn't too much grant money out there to go send some people to research this. There's something really rare and cool about this color morph. Besides that, color morphs are rare to show up in our native fishes to begin with. But it's when this melanism, or this expression of non-typical dark pigment, does occur in a fish, it usually affects the entire body of the fish, not just a small portion. There are only a small number of species of fishes reported to have this small portion covering melanism, like we see on some of our ornamental aquarium fishes, like some species of live bearers. These black-nosed Crappie really are a very nifty anomaly. I know Mississippi has some stocking programs for Magnolia Crappie, and again, black-nosed Crappie can appear naturally anywhere there are black Crappie populations. I know at least 13 states have seen them, probably more. So good luck nabbing some different types of crappies, fish responsibly, and good luck.